Hello there and welcome to the value of everything. So we are looking into what is hyperinflation, examples in history, why do governments hyperinflate, measures and controls, vested interests, the precursors leading up to hyperinflation, the phases of the hyperinflation cycle, what governments do in these times. One of the more common things that you may hear is this time it's different, and there is some particular examples where it is different to examples that have happened in the past. And finally, at the end, we will just go through a few fairly simple measures in which we can protect ourselves if we find that the value exchange mechanism has crashed. Okay, firstly, this is a word of warning. Do not financially prepare yourself around this presentation. It is best for you to use your own independent thought and get multiple sources of information, compile it, and make the best choices for you and your loved one's needs. In my opinion, one of the most important assets to possess if we are in a state of hyperinflation is independent thought. So that is definitely one thing I would like to emphasize for starters. Generally, there is quite a few definitions as to what hyperinflation is, so I have pulled a few pieces of information together and really put it into my own version of a definition, which I find easy to understand for myself. So, hyperinflation is when a government loses control of the economy by putting increasingly more fiat currency supply into circulation to maintain power over the nation. There is a number of examples of hyperinflation throughout history. I will give you a few examples, but in general, wherever you find that there has been a fiat money supply which has been debased from a physical metal like gold, then you eventually result in a hyperinflation scenario. Now, for each one of these examples, there are different dynamics at play. I would recommend looking into each one of these and seeing how the governments have managed the economic state under different internal and external factors. We have had France between 1795 and 96, the Weimar Republic between 1920 and 1923, which was predominantly based upon war reparations. China between 1947 and 49, Argentina between 1991 and 92, but it sort of is still floating around in the system. Yugoslavia between 92 and 94, which did lead to genocide, and Zimbabwe from 1998 to 2008. So there has been certainly some long sessions of hyperinflation. Where I state these timelines, it's not exact in any manner. You could say that there is a gradual exponential growth. The precursors to hyperinflation do take root way back, almost as far as back as 100 years. The double-digit inflation rate is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the historic narrative, which has led up to that point. So, why do governments hyperinflate? Well, governments don't necessarily choose to hyperinflate. It begins with economic systems, policies, and advisors incorrectly reading or neglecting warning indicators. After time, it's too late not to see the red lights, but it's too late to turn back due to corrupting party power politics. A 4 to 5 year termed government chooses to put off economic hardship in favour for votes at the polls. Also, choosing not to inflate can destruct the power of government to deficit spend further. Alright, now we are going into measurements and controls. Why do governments want a high GDP, gross domestic product, and a modest inflation rate? So let's look at GDP, or gross domestic product. It's a measurement of economic growth, right? Well, that's actually wrong. They are actually calculating the price in their own fiat currency of either all expenditures or all incomes. So you could buy a piece of art which has nothing to do with economic progress, and that does get baked into the mix. Also, if you are increasing the money supply, there is more money chasing economic activity. Therefore, you are artificially manipulating that the economy has grown. But this does help governments to pay off their issued bonds. In truth, to measure economic progress, you have to measure producing higher quality or quantity of goods with less time, energy, and matter. There has been different examples or alternatives which have been put out there looking at social economic situations, the saving rates, and also happiness indicators. However, governments generally ignore them. Okay, now we're looking at the inflation rate. So the government purposely selects a basket of goods which usually don't inflate that much, like bananas and your membership to a dating website, and avoid large inflating assets. So big ticket items which do inflate quite rapidly, like a house, is left off the inflation rate. This means while the subprime lending fiasco was happening, there would have been a measure of the inflation happening in the market, and the government could have stepped in and raised interest rates to control the bubble. However, it was totally blinded to the fact that this was happening. So it's important just to remember there is this range of inflation, just this nice light inflation rate, which is very beneficial for governments, because on either end of the scale you'll have deflation, which is in theory the government's worst enemy, because they cannot pay off their bonds and eventually would lead them to default. Governments do have a lot of unfunded liabilities which require loans to sustain the system. So if you cannot pay your police, military, and tax collectors, essentially the power of the government finishes at that point. It's great if you do have a job because goods do get cheaper, but shops find it tricky as people will save rather than spend. So on the other side of the scale, we have inflation or hyperinflation, where the government finds it very easy to pay off the bond issuance, but in the process, they impoverish the people's spending power. If you have a job, you'll want a raise, or essentially you'll be paid less in real terms. Also, shops should be busy as people would rather purchase goods than have cash which is losing value. Okay, now we're up to vested interests. So there are winners and losers in the majority of situations. Governments and high net worth people usually like inflationary environments. Liquidity cash flow is abundant and enables to leverage from debt market loans and apply that to asset acquisitions. A lot of profit is being made from capital gains, whereby people are creating a pseudo Ponzi scheme. People sit back and see more debt chase more debt without improving the productive economy. After the 2007-2008 financial crisis, deflation massively hit asset prices. And as a consequence of that, the average net worth of the extremely wealthy went down by 23% in 12 months. The world actually afterwards had 700 1,093 billionaires, down from 1,125. So, what are the precursors? It's a long gradual process, but the gradient of the cliff quickly falls. Deflation starts to creep into asset markets. Devaluations start to occur, like in the subprime housing market in America. Debt is chasing more debt, and there is an element of easing of lending processes which do manifest themselves in this scenario. What was thought to be improving industries with better quality or quantity goods being created with less time, energy and matter was purely valuation appreciation hoax made by loans used to finance more loans. As soon as investors cannot flip and acquire more assets to continuously expand on a Ponzi scheme, then there is a massive retraction and exodus of investors, which is so rapid that the asset valuations dropped in unparalleled proportions until you look back to the days of the 1930s depression. The conclusion becomes that the majority of the market was a pure asset speculation vehicle for people to access credit and flip their gains up the ladder of asset acquisitions. Everyone has been so swept up in debt-fueled consumption that it's hard to distinguish what is a valuable asset which brings in an income in comparison to a speculative bubble. Next up, governments will intervene. They always do. They can choose to swallow the medicine and let the mechanisms of price discovery happen until the market eventually hits a floor, but there is problems in terms of unfunded liabilities and its bond issuance, which I went into before. So unless they want a military uprising or something on those civil unrest scales, they will continue to increase the money supply by means of issuance of more loans. The governments do not want to unveil themselves and reveal that a lot of the spending was purely debt-fueled. Promises were backed up by money that wasn't there. Loans are issued to give people stuff in the moment, but in the long term, it always impoverishes. That being said, government finds no alternative other than to kick the can down the road further and apply more expansion of the money system by issuance of more loans. Commercial banks will create loan products which governments will purchase off them with money created out of thin air, thus increasing the liquidity or the amount of loans which can be issued into the greater economy. This is what is known as quantitative easing, the enabler of speculative bubble flipping. I guess as time progresses, people may be exposing quantitative easing for what it really is, but you still cannot discount that quantitative easing could reach QE 4, 5, 6, 7 to infinity and beyond. With QE, they have a fixed amount of assets which will be over a certain term. This eventually gets tapered off over time, so there is a gradual reduction of liquidity in the market. There is obviously the method of direct capital injection into people's pockets, but that is usually associated with failed states. So they usually will not try that unless it's the very last resort. As another means to combat the amount of debt in the system, governments could apply debt forgiveness. However, that does destroy banks and its shareholders, and they would really have to be nationalized. Considering that banks are political parties' biggest funders, it won't be in political manifestos anytime soon. Usually it's found that governments will eventually lead to direct capital injection, This will work depending on how hard people were hit by the prior incident. People have potentially had their fingers burnt, something like Cyprus bank bailings, where the depositors' money was used or stolen to prop up the banks, and forced cash withdrawal controls of no more than, say, $100 a day. So hoarding is a big problem for governments, as it's been for Japan for quite some time. When hoarding does occur, capitalism does get limited to a certain extent because you can no longer access capital to retool your factory and make better quality or quantity of goods. As soon as people get their hands on cash, they won't spend it but squirrel it away and hide it underneath the mattress. On an environmental scale, you could see that people are using materials in more of a sustainable way. After a while of hoarding, goods do become harder to acquire, so not only cash gets hoarded, but assets do get hoarded. Also, people like to acquire foreign capital reserves, say foreign currency, but at the same time, foreign nations are getting rid of their capital reserves. They are selling their currency out into the market, thus it requires more foreign notes to purchase foreign assets, increasing the inflation rate. Also, capital flight will occur from corporations, the upper and middle classes, compounding money supply issues even further. Remember, this is happening on a backdrop of too much debt in the system, which requires repayment. Governments are running at deficits, so this is the interest on the debt it holds, and usually it is at a rate of 50% or more of the nation's gross domestic product. Governments will try to reassure the public that the worst is over and the issue lies with liquidity, but generally it's not, and it requires a hard landing for people to realize true value. Okay, so we've gone through the precursors which lead up to hyperinflation. Now we're going to actually be inside hyperinflation and see what happens on the ground. I believe that the general first phase of hyperinflation is going to be skipped in this example. Commonly, we have workers demand an increased wage, not based upon previous inflation figures, but to get ahead of the game and go in advance of inflation trends. This usually signals to governments that there is a lack of money in the system and they have to jump onto the printing presses. However, this is going to be bypassed. Corporations are already in survival mode in a majority of places, taking on staff when asset depreciations are happening all around them, and plus they are also buying back their own stock valuations, means that there is too much risk in the system for them to take on more staff and expand the payroll. So with this bypass, I suggest that there will be the cash injection. Obviously, this can materialize in a number of ways. So with this extra money in people's pockets, people are going to go to the shops and stock up. The problem is, shops live and die on cash flow. If they do not have enough cash flow, they will not have the ability to restock their shelves. So they have to stay ahead of the inflation rate to stay solvent. Also, selling your goods the next day will most likely get you more bang for your buck, so most shops will be happy to store their assets until they can achieve that high price. This is the thing that most people do not expect. The rate of price increases outstrip the money in the economy, so even in a hyperinflation state, money shortages happen. Now, the next phase is quite important. The credit lending starts to slow down until it ends up shutting down completely. So if you lent at a rate which is lower than the inflation rate, you are essentially wiped out. So you take on shorter and shorter term lending overnight or over an hour period to ensure that you stay solvent as well. Capital raising for improving production is essentially destroyed here. The longer this lasts, wealth generation is destroyed. Also, any wealthy foreigners with a stronger currency will definitely come to the country and try to acquire good capital production assets for fire sale prices. Next up is cash conversion to assets. This is the beginning of the end of the currency and the very start of potentially a new. This might not be an actual currency but a black market barter system. But this is the green shoots of the free market trying to take root. Demand is skyrocketing whilst production is reaching its all-time lows. Now, the final act. This is where everybody loses faith in the nation's currency. It is no longer a means to exchange value or either a store of wealth. So now we're going to look into what governments may do. Now they have the arms of law courts, military and police force to pass anything they wish to decree. I would probably think on the lines that governments will pass laws and measures to prevent the value of the currency to fall any further. However, this will usually be found as counterintuitive. Every time you try to prevent something from happening, there will be an equal and opposite reaction to it. So once they've added all the zeros to the end of the currency notes, they can potentially try to delete them all off. Say $1 trillion bill being converted into a $100 bill. They can impose bans of gold, Bitcoin, and stockpiling of another currency, or even stockpiling food and water. In Zimbabwe, there was confiscation of the agricultural land. So basically, people who were very productive at working on the land were replaced by people who did favours for the government. This does entrench the means of production even further. The government's narrative on foreigners purchasing assets becomes worse. Eventually, they put a lot of controls and restrictions on that, and it sometimes manifests itself in passing foreign national laws to kick non-citizens and press out of the country. Censorship can be evoked, and that could also reach out to censorship of social media platforms. Just keep in mind that the lifeblood of the government is the taxation system and the military. If they cannot be paid for, then the government crashes itself. So tax administration and military spending will continuously expand. Do not discount the government's means to find out new novel ways to tax its citizens. There will be more of an air of national pride and patriotism, and if anybody is seen to reject the currency, it is deemed to be unpatriotic. Also, when you find governments at their weakest, more volatility, quicker overthrowings, and potentially military coups can occur. Extreme forms of government can happen, from fascism to socialism. Remember, governments will try to point the finger of blame at any minority, from, say, the benefit culture to the upper class to the foreign nationals, but they will never point the finger at themselves. Okay, this time it's different. Usually you will hear that just before a crash, but I will try to apply that reasoning to the current situation. So, all of the Western nations have been complicit in currency devaluations. So, one of the benefits of when one economy falls, you can pass the border and exchange goods on the black market. Now, if you have got no place to hide, then there is certain problems in this scenario. Also, for the West, to increase profit margins for the corporations, there has been a lot of factories been outsourced to, say, China, and that means that in the West predominantly there is just this very large service sector. The problem with the service sector is that it really supplies wants more so than needs, which potentially will be the economic state in the future. In the past, a lot of people had back gardens. Now we've built very, very large super cities with no real means to produce our own food. So this is another overlooking point of the West in terms of self-sustainability. Also, a lot of the Western countries haven't made too many friends abroad, so terrorist extremists can uprise with a lot more frequency. Particularly also if there is more controls on guns and firearms, then there will be less of an ability for people to protect themselves. Also, you have to wonder when government security is down because of budgetary constraints, we may worry about weapons of mass destruction being passed into the wrong hands. Hopefully I haven't depressed you too much so far, but also we have an issue with energy. We have reached the productive means of easy extraction, and from this point, or not so far away from this point, it's going to get increasingly harder to extract things like oil from the ground. This has been an easy and abundant energy source. This crisis will conflict with the high living standards that we currently enjoy. But if you open channels of communication, you open the arms of the free market, we may well devise better productive means to produce higher quality and higher quantity of goods with less energy, time and matter. Who knows, we may even find alternative sources of energy. Okay, so this is sort of a benefit and sometimes a little bit of a hindrance. We do have now multicultural societies. This means that there probably is less so of this sense of national pride and things like that. However, you still potentially could have a circumstance where people could be vindicated for the wrong reasons. But you see that there is less so of a chance of racism to come into fruition. Also, there is a slight problem with in terms of unity of cultures. So usually there is certain amounts of statistics that have been put out there that if people are of a multicultural society, there is less trust. Unfortunately, that's just the way people think. Okay, so this time it's different. Also, we do have some major benefits. The first one, which is going to be the most interesting in this time, is Bitcoin. We do have an alternative means to exchange value, which does not have any government control. This does have the potential of completely bypassing the government and having a free market system. That's why there is a massive amount of interest. Also, on the other hand, you will find that the government will eventually turn around and be negative against Bitcoin itself because it conflicts with its power. Another one is social media. Now, we have never had such an opportunity to contact like-minded people. Also, obviously, terrorism has. So this is an interesting part, but the positives essentially outweigh the negatives. So this is a major benefit for humanity. Alright, so the final part, how to protect yourself. Unfortunately, every country is racing to the bottom for a competitive edge in its currency. When the tide turns and people demand a currency which holds some kind of purchasing power, the government will find itself in a position to choose a lesser evil. So, as I mentioned before, thinking for yourself is very important. Play out thought experiments of probable situations in your head, time and time again, and you will definitely conjure up some good ideas which are relevant to your needs. Obviously, when the shit hits the fan, you will not only have resourcefulness on your side, but potentially even opportunities to grasp. Keep in mind markets and an ability to trade with people. There will be social media and there will be opportunity to exchange goods and services there for virtuous means. Social media has brought people closer together, however, the personal touch has been somewhat brought back. So having good face-to-face contact with very good friends is going to be an amazing benefit to have. I'm just going to give you a tiny shopping list. Obviously, anybody can really put this together for their own personal needs. It just depends on your own risk assessment and what you actually think is potentially going to happen. But these things don't necessarily cost too much money, so yeah, it's just something to consider. So firstly, a water filter, like a big Berkeley, just in case water systems get stopped for whatever reason. A solar energy charger or even a generator is much better. Communication is vital, so wind-up radios, walkie-talkies, access to the dark web, understanding peer-to-peer networks would be very handy. A big bag of rice, loads of tinned food, beans. If they go close to expiry, donate them. It's not much of a big deal. They'll go to charity and you'll feel better for it. Being close to supply lines during these times is extremely beneficial. Even during the Second World War, when there was rationing happening, my grandfather was a market porter and he ensured that his family never went hungry. All of this stuff does take nerves. It's a lot about looking at people in the eye, shaking their hand, really being brave and making connections that you wouldn't necessarily do. A friend who is a farmer is going to be a very useful friend to have. So invest in your human capital. Think not of the economy that we have now, but potentially the economy that would happen in the future. Government is going to be very limited, so business opportunities will arise when people demand. Power may be decentralized into forms of serfdom where landowners rule over their domain. Non-violent cooperative societies are a good place to aim towards. I've made a few demonstrations on how blockchain moral exchange value systems can work to liberate people. I would definitely recommend checking those out. In a lot of people's minds, they're going to have their worlds ruined. After the 1930s crash, suicides climbed to their highest rate. Where you get people, especially middle-aged men who were once the head of the house and the main breadwinners, finding themselves unwanted and they have no skills for this new economy, they're going to find themselves in a lot of pain and they will try to numb it out with alcoholism. This will have a disastrous effect on families and particularly impressionable children who will witness this. People are very ingrained to the comforts in their world. The key to life is to take brave steps to adapt to our environment. This is why women like men who approach them who are brave and confident. Essentially, it's a survival skill which is being displayed. People who once were something are going to find themselves crash to reality where they find all their skills redundant. They have to learn a new skill, speak from a position of vulnerability, and be met with failure and rejection on a countless basis. It will be a case of being resilient, showing true grit, sweeping yourself down, casting away any ill feelings, and replacing that with a sense of optimism as you walk out of your house seeking for a better day than the one before. Replacing a fat juicy steak for a thin watery soup is going to be a very bitter thing to swallow. Try to surround yourself in an echo chamber of good souls which will warm your heart. There definitely will be a revaluation of what is important in life once this is all over. When looking back, I believe that a lot of people will speak of us undergoing a great sickness of the mind, but what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. You may be one of those who can rise to the occasion. People will show their solidarity to the one who stands up and is brave. In times of fear, people are looking to others to rescue them from the abyss. Be careful not to abuse power which you may possess in these times. The kindness of humanity has a chance to reignite. Maybe this world has been very self-absorbed, but now there will potentially be a new golden dawn. Thank you very much for your time. Please pass on this show to anybody who may benefit, and please do subscribe if you would like to hear more shows.